man was walking in the woods one day when he saw a bear out of the corner of his eye. He stopped, said a silent prayer. God, I know you can do all things. Will you please make this bear a fellow Christian? The bear caught up to the man, placed his paw on the man's shoulder, and said, Brother, will you pray with me? Dear God, for this meal that I'm about to receive, make me truly thankful. This is The Christian Bear with Dr. Ben Hulskamp. Welcome to episode 41 of The Christian Bear. I'm your host, Dr. Ben Hulskamp. Today it's my pleasure to welcome my friend and pastor, the Reverend Ben Perry, to the podcast. Ben, a passionate advocate for building church that lives into God's blessed queerness, serves as the Minister of Outreach and Media Strategy at Middle Collegiate Church in New York City. They have also worked with the New York chapter of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, with Union Theological Seminary, and at Time Inc. An award-winning writer, Ben's work can be found in outlets including the Washington Post, Slate, the Huffington Post, Sojourners, Bustle, and Motherboard. His book, Crybaby, Why Our Tears Matter, will be released in May of 2023. Ben lives with his wife Erin and with his brother in Maine. Join me in welcoming the Reverend Ben Perry to the Christian Bear. Okay, Ben, thank you again for joining us for this episode of the Christian Bear. I'm very happy to have you here and to have your perspective as part of our series on belief. To get us started, this is what I've been sarcastically calling the easy question. What do you believe?
Well, thanks so much for having me on the show, Ben. Just that.
Yeah, it's really just that, and I'm going to say for our listeners, Ben has actually not seen these questions beforehand. So unlike our other guests who sort of laughed at this question with the benefit of preparation, Ben is coming at this completely new. But yeah. So the first question is literally, what do you believe?
Yeah. I'm laughing because that changes on an almost daily basis. I think if we're talking about my faith, one of the things that I've taken great solace in is not having to have a fixed definition of God, not having to have a fixed definition of what I believe. That the moment I relinquished the overwhelming need and desire to know once and forever what are the articles of my faith, what is my creed, I all of a sudden felt this enormous weight lift and realized that I could just show up to places genuinely, fully myself, trying the best I'm able to love the people around me, trying to cultivate a life that feels joyful, that feels genuine and real, trying to build relationships with other people. So in as much as I believe things, they're in service of that completely. But here's a few things that I believe. I believe that there's magic and wonder in the world. I think that when we open ourselves up to the joy and tenderness of living, that we're able to come more fully into ourselves and able to root deeply in our relationships with other people. I think that we were created fundamentally good. They're going to throw me out of the Presbyterian Church, but I've already passed all my ordination exams, so joke's on them. But yeah, I don't buy into doctrines of depravity, of universal sin. I think that we live in oppressive systems. I believe that we are constantly enmeshed and tangled up in forces that do not wish our thriving and our flourishing. But I don't actually believe that is fundamentally who we are. I think that we are most naturally and fully ourselves when we're loving each other. When I was in seminary, I had the great privilege of studying with Dr. Cornel West, and he would frequently say that tenderness is what love looks like in private, and justice is what love looks like in public. And I think in some of the earlier part of my career, I was very fixedly focused on the second half of that equation. And I still, care deeply about the kinds of collective justice work we do as an expression of love. But more and more in my own private faith life, I find myself very wrapped up in the first part of that question. Tenderness is what love looks like in private. I'm fortunate and blessed to be somebody who does some public theology and gets to serve a church like Middle Church that I think does incredible, wonderful, amazing justice work in the world. And I'm so, so grateful to get to do that work as a professional calling. It brings me such joy, and I feel such a deep debt of gratitude that people trust me to do that kind of work in community with them. But when I'm not in those spaces, when I'm not Reverend Benjamin Perry and I'm just Ben, what I'm most concerned with is how can I be that tender person for my partner, Erin, for my closest friends, for the wonderful queer community that I've cultivated around myself. How can I love people fully and tenderly? How can I create platonic affection that manifests in really deep and beautiful friendships? And when I'm able to do that, when I'm able to sort of live as that version of myself, I find myself believing fully that it's possible on a broader sense. That's sort of when the pendulum swings the other way, and I get these visions for how we might live collectively if things were different. And I believe that we are capable of that kind of collective tenderness, not just in an interpersonal way.
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate and resonate with everything you just said. And I'm curious if you would be willing to expand on actually something earlier you said in that last comment about your beliefs changing often. I think a lot of the listeners of this podcast are in that kind of broad group of ex-evangelicals or like me, a quote unquote recovering Catholic. And I think for lots of us, and I would imagine this might be true in your past as well. We were raised to look at our ministers, to look at anyone with reverend in front of their name, and think that their belief was unshakable, was never changing. I think some of us who have ourselves gone into professional life in ministry and in religion have found out that that's probably not 100% the case. But I wonder if you could comment a bit on staying open, I guess, to changes in belief, while simultaneously being a minister and pastor.
Yeah, you're on with Reverend Shaking Reed here. But yeah, and it's interesting because unlike so many folks who find themselves in sort of these progressive faith spaces, I actually didn't come, particularly for queer folks in religious spaces. I don't actually come from a background of religious trauma. Evangelicalism or sort of more traditional Catholicism, or I grew up in a pretty affirming church. It was a lovely little Presbyterian church, very traditional in its worship, but expansive in its love. Was actually very involved in the fight for queer ordination, like long before it was popular or allowed. My minister actually took a real big risk on ordaining people as elders before it was allowed by the church, and was almost defrocked because of it. I mean, it was a beautiful place to grow up. And simultaneously, while it shaped me in really important ways in terms of my values and some of my, sensibilities of what I find comforting in a worshipful environment, things like that, I'd never really found a faith that set my soul on fire. And so by the time I was sort of at the end of high school, I wasn't very much involved in church anymore. When I left high school, I was, did a lot of music programs in the church when I was in high school, and that sort of kept me tethered. But then when I left and I went to college, I stopped going to church altogether. And I didn't really think about God, and I didn't really think about faith. And so I think part of my adult life, when I then was able to go to seminary, because I sort of had a crisis of conscience and wanted to figure out what the heck I was doing with life, uh, I was able to study with folks who helped me understand a Christianity that felt vibrant and alive in my life, and that felt like an active source of joy and comfort. Something that really did set my soul on fire, and what I think was really, really essential in that formative period when I was in seminary was the vast diversity of different faith expressions and religious traditions, and orthopraxic rituals that I was exposed to, and it really ignited in me a desire for a faith life that was not rooted in one place, because I think that for me felt sort of very ossified. That was sort of what I was running away from. It wasn't necessarily that I was running away from a place that was traumatic, because it wasn't, but I was fleeing a place where faith felt very sleepy. And I wanted something that really felt vibrant. And for me, and maybe it's my ADHD and the way that my brain doesn't like to stay in one place, but when I'm able to really shift in my religious expression, the kinds of rituals I'm taking part in, when I am able to, one of the things I love about worshiping at Middle is like the profound multiculturalism that shapes our community. And it means that, every different Sunday is going to be something, oftentimes radically different than the Sunday that was, Sunday that preceded it. And that kind of, I don't say even variety, but just diversity, like rich diversity, has articulated for me a faith that is very comfortable with the sort of trappings of it changing. And I think that's oftentimes the place that people have, like that churches and other, faith organizations have the most rigidity around. I actually don't think that people are all, that uncomfortable with, at least in some of the more mainline traditions that I come from, people aren't, that uncomfortable actually with, an understanding of God that changes and moves. It's like somebody changed the color on the chancel table, and now we're going to have a session meeting because this is a crisis. And so I think those sort of the willingness to embrace changing trappings around our faith has also nourished for me a comfort with a God who's also changing. And so part of this, comes into my own, understanding of process theology and some of the ways that I, really have come to see God not as a static sort of fixed object, but more as a verb, a verb, not a noun, if you will, the way that I sort of see God becoming, not only just through my own experience of, my look on history or my experience personally, but also just the way that I read the Bible and I see, God changing and growing alongside humanity. And I think that that's really, really beautiful. And I know that's not a tremendously orthodox perspective, but I've also hit a point where I don't really care very much about what an orthodox perspective is. And if that gets me in trouble, well then, I'll be in trouble, but I'll be happy. So I think that that's sort of where I've come to, is this place that, when I am honest about the way that I see God changing in my own life, and honest about the way that I see, love being this constant and yet malleable and adaptable force in the world, that to me speaks to a God that is not afraid to be different tomorrow because the demands of tomorrow are different than they are today.
Thank you. So you've talked about public theology, and I often talk about public theology on this podcast as well. I wonder, for our listeners, I wonder if you could kind of define what you mean when you talk about public theology, and particularly bringing belief, bringing faith into public life.
Yeah, it's funny because on a one level, it's just sort of a very self-aggrandizing way of just saying preaching in a different medium, because that's honestly how I approach it. I, I know it was interesting when I was going through my ordination process because I was actually ordained into public theology. I wasn't ordained into a church. It was one of the first times that I know of that the Presbyterian Church um, was did a sort of there's a separate ordination process, and you can go and you can be ordained into sort of other ministerial callings. And they said, at the time I was working for Union Theological Seminary, uh, doing sort of like public theology work for them. And I went through all these, ordination hearings where people were saying, "Oh, well, but is this really ministry? You're just like writing things online. You're writing articles. You're on social media. Like, is that really ministry?" And I'm like, well, I really view it like preaching. That's really sort of where I come to. I love to preach in a pulpit, and I know that a lot of the people who I care most about are folks who may not ever feel comfortable walking into a church and sitting in a pew and hearing my words from a pulpit, but who might come across something that I tweet, and it might speak to them in a way that is life-giving and nurturing, of their own faith, of their own wholeness. Uh, and that for me is what I care most about, is finding people where they are and speaking a word that hopefully ignites greater love for the world around them and greater love for themselves. And so that's, when I think about public theology, it's really a way of saying I'm interested in changing the medium by which I, as a minister, am speaking into the world. I think one of my great heroes in this work is Fred Rogers, both because I, I grew up in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood and was exposed to ministry in a form that was deeply formative for me at a time when I wasn't even thinking about it like that. I just knew I loved the trolley to yesterday. Um, but as an adult, I see that as such a beautiful expression of somebody who was able to take the core tenets of what I think make great preaching, telling people that they're special, telling people that they're sacred, telling people that they're loved, telling people they belong in community and that they can do something wondrous with their lives. All of those aspects are fully alive in this beautiful television program he created, but he realized that he could actually do that work much more effectively for himself, in this other format than had he. I'm sure he would have been a wonderful pulpit preacher, but that wasn't the work that he felt called to. One of the things that for me draws me to public theology is that I really love putting together different kinds of preaching. I don't think that saying words is the only way that one can preach. And so I'm thinking about one of my favorite uh, projects I've ever done was I put together while I was at Union this photojournalism package called Queer Faith that was just 40 some odd different seminarians and faculty and staff at Union talking about their own queer identity and how that dovetailed with their faith and how they understand both of those as life-giving, nourishing parts of who they are. Um, and we ended up turning it into a big photojournalism, like a big gallery exhibit, and hung it in a church, and people got to see themselves enshrined like icons in this space. But I got all sorts of messages from people all over the country who would write things and say, I didn't know that God could love me because nobody ever told me that they could. I didn't know that somebody like you could be a minister. I didn't know like somebody like me could be a minister. And that kind of reception, when I put things in the world and I get a DM from a trans teenager who says, my family doesn't affirm me, what do I do? And I can't offer them a new family, which is what they deserve. But I can say, I'm really sorry. You deserve so much better than that. And I am able to have that moment through some ones and zeros. There is no doubt in my mind that that is ministry every bit as deep as somebody who goes to their corner parish and puts on a robe in the morning and does that work in a church. And I'm not denigrating parish ministry. I have incredible respect for people who have that calling. and maybe I will find myself in a more traditional parish role at some point in my life later down the road. I don't know. But what I do know right now is that being able to be creative and artistic and bold and open in the way that I formulate my preaching, the way that I formulate my ministry, being truly expansive of who I'm trying to reach, that feels like the most honest and genuine expression of what I have to offer the world right now. And so I'm going to keep doing it as long as it feels good and right. And maybe there'll become a time when I don't really want to do public theology anymore, and I want to do ministry in a different kind of way, and that'll be beautiful too. But yeah, that's sort of how I understand public theology. Is just it's just ministry, just with the through some different mediums.
Thank you. So earlier in the podcast, you, in quoting Dr. Cornel West, mentioned his quote of love being tenderness in private and justice in public. Am I getting that right?
Yep. Yeah, you got it right.
So, thinking of love as tenderness in private, I wonder if we can shift a little bit to your book that's coming out soon,
Yeah.
titled Crybaby. I wonder if you can talk about that and about this idea of crying and crying as religious experience.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Yeah, so the book comes out in May. It's called Cry Baby: Why Our Tears Matter. Um, and it started actually because it actually started with an essay that I wrote that ended up in the Washington Post about uh, the grief that we were not grieving during the pandemic in a public way. Um, I was really I during the beginning of the pandemic, I was living right next to Columbia Presbyterian Hospital, just 2 blocks away, and I could look outside my window and see the trucks that they were parking in front because the morgues were too full. I could hear sirens wailing all hours of the night, and it was the juxtaposition of watching my neighbors die and this stultifying silence in a broader culture that, as much as anything, felt so painfully untenable. And it brought me back to thinking about a time in my life when I was first in seminary, and a professor asked sort of us collectively to talk to each other about the last time we had wept. And I realized in that moment that I hadn't cried in like a decade. And I knew as I was coming to this realization, oh my God, I haven't cried in years, that there was something fundamentally broken about that. That was a sign of something in me that I needed to heal. Um, and so I started this uh, truly wild spiritual practice where I made myself cry every day. I like that night. Actually, I went home and I was like, okay, today's the day I'm going to cry, and I like forced myself to cry that night through much laborious effort. And then over the course of like the next several months, every day I would just make myself cry, and I would find a way to bring myself to tears. And in the beginning, it was very, very hard, and then gradually it got easier, and I found that I was able to reconnect to what I was feeling in a way that I hadn't in a very long time. I sort of felt that visceral resurrection in my body. And so then, fast forwarding 10 years to being in this pandemic moment where I saw so much grief around me and yet heard so little grief expressed. I wrote an essay talking about my own process, learning how to cry again, and saying that needs to be something that we should do collectively. Like we collectively need to learn how to cry again. And an editor for Broadleaf read it and reached out and said, "Hey, would you be interested in writing a whole book on crying?" I hadn't thought about writing a book on crying until then, but the more I thought about it, the more I saw crying as this just really beautiful essentially fundamentally human way that we connect with one another. One of the metaphors that I use in the introduction of my book is talking about, in the same way that light is refracted through a raindrop into a beautiful assortment of colors. I think that there are so many parts of our humanity that are refracted through our tears. I think so much of our longing, our grief, our joy is wrapped up in crying, which at sort of most fundamental is like an overpouring of feeling. It's like we have so much feeling inside of us that all of a sudden, like, our bodies literally can't hold it in anymore, and we start to it starts coming out. And that's why we cry from so many different causes, whether it's deep sorrow or ecstatic joy or pride, or there's so many different ways that we'll find ourselves almost just overcome with this feeling. And then sort of the flip side of that, when we think about all of the different forces that suppress tears, the toxic patriarchy, and like in women, the ways that so many folk get caught up in a double bind of being too emotional or not emotional enough, or the ways that we suppress Black grief because frankly we don't want to face the trauma that we've inflicted on Black communities, or the ways that crying is wielded deceptively. I mean, there's so much just stuff wrapped up in our crying, and why we feel so ambivalent about it so often, that it just became this really rich soil to do some theological work, where I was able to sort of dig into some parts of what I think really make us fundamentally human, our connection, our the fact that we were made for community. Crying is this beautiful physical manifestation of the way that our bodies are designed to solicit care from people around us. Like, what a beautiful, beautiful thing. The ways that it also, in a private moment, reminds us of what we care about most deeply, the clarifying effect of crying. Like, there's so much like theology wrapped up in there. And then the sort of, again, the flip side, that justice work of what the suppression of tears has done, who that benefits, why people are so intent on suppressing people's emotions. Like, all of that is, to me, just a beautiful way to think about, if we were to create a world where our tears could truly be held, what will it take to get there, and who could we be if we got there? Like, those are questions that are really interesting to me, and so that's why I decided to write a book about it.
Amen. So then this last question is um, uh, sort of the final question in this podcast series, and it is equally as easy as the first one. If you had to boil your beliefs down into one core fundamental belief, what would it be and why?
I don't know why, but a Switchfoot lyric just popped into my brain. Like, we were meant for so much more. I mean, that honestly is a core, as much of a core fundamental belief as I have, is that we were meant for more than this. I look at the way that so many people are living right now, the unnecessary pain and anguish that we carry, the way that we live in systems that are intentionally designed against our flourishing. And then I look and see at the beauty and richness and life that people carry within them, the art that we are capable of, the tenderness and love to which we are capable. And the yawning gap between how we are living and how we could live, that's where I feel called to stand in that breach, to sort of name that fundamental tension between who God created us to be and how we're living. So that's really where I come to it, and not only, to add an addendum. Now I'm really cheating. I'm wrapping other things into it. You're gonna end up with 7 different beliefs in my one belief. But if the part A of that is we were meant for so much more than this, the part B is we are capable of getting there. When I see just how fucking smart people are and how courageous people are. The way that, even little kids will be endlessly inventive and imaginative of coming up with new ways of doing things. I'm really tired of the cynicism that is so often presented as if it's wisdom. I don't want to live like that personally. I can't. I need more than that. I need to believe that as messy, as bad as things are, that we are capable of making them better. But it's not just a need. I really believe that. I believe I've seen the love that people share. I've seen alternative ways of building community, of nourishing life. I know that we can get there.
Amen. Thank you. So like I said before we started recording, I love leaving time at the end of each episode for guests to platform anything that they're working on, promote anything that they're working on, or talk about anything around belief that we didn't get to. So the floor is yours.
So I'll leave you with a benediction. But yeah, I guess related to sort of my answer to the first question, if I could loop back there, I would say people carry so much shame around not knowing what they believe. There's so much anxiety and guilt and fear about what do we know or believe to be true. And I think that anxiety speaks to a deeper fear, which is that what if I'm not the right kind of person? And so if you're listening to this, if you have even one iota of that shame, that fear that I might not be right, I just want to tell you that you are so wondrous and sacred and blessed. That even when you don't know exactly where you're headed, there is love waiting for you on that journey. That frankly, I think the people who say they have it all figured out are just better liars. But lean into that uncertainty because there is wonder waiting for you. If you want a little companion guide, Crybaby, Why Our Tears Patter is out this May. You can pre-order it now anywhere books are sold. But I'll leave you with the benediction that I end my book with. It's called A Blessing for Crying. If you've lost your tears, may you find them again. Know that you are never beyond redemption and worthy of full emotional life. May crying nourish you, a balm for the wounds you still carry, and a salve on fresh hurt. As droplets fall, may they water new growth, and may our collective weeping shape a world better than the one we inherited. May we attune ourselves to grief and hold the places we are broken, repairers of the breach. May cries long silenced be heard in full, yeast for our communal rising. Hold each other fiercely, not to build a future where every eye is dry, but one where we weep copiously from the joy and tenderness of living.
Amen. Thank you, my friend, for a really amazing episode and reflection on your beliefs and on your work. I'm just really appreciative of your time and of you being a guest on the Christian Bear.
Well, so glad to be invited. Thank you so much, Ben.
This has been the Christian Bear with Dr. Ben Hillskamp.